The morning of my wedding felt unreal, like I was living inside a dream that had taken months to plan. The church was filled with soft music, white flowers, and people who had come to celebrate what they believed was the happiest day of my life. I stood in a quiet room behind the ceremony hall, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My dress was perfect, the kind I had imagined since I was a teenager. My hands trembled slightly, not because I was nervous about marrying Dorian, but because everything felt so big and important. In just a short time, I would walk down the aisle and start a new chapter of my life. I remember hearing laughter and quiet conversations from the hall as guests arrived. My parents were greeting relatives, and the atmosphere was warm and joyful. Everyone believed they were about to witness a beautiful love story. I believed it too. For months, I had imagined this exact moment, standing beside Dorian Kessler while we promised to spend our lives together. When the music finally started, my heart beat faster. I held my father's arm as the doors opened and the guests turned to look at me. The aisle seemed longer than I remembered during rehearsals. At the end of it stood Dorian, dressed in a dark suit, smiling calmly as if nothing in the world could disturb him. He looked confident and composed, the same way he always looked whenever he entered a room. As I walked forward, I saw familiar faces on both sides. Some guests smiled warmly, others wiped away emotional tears. Among them stood my maid of honor, Maribel Knox. She had been my closest friend since childhood, someone who had been with me through every major moment of my life. Seeing her there beside the altar made me feel comforted. I thought everything was exactly the way it should be. When I finally reached the front, my father gently placed my hand in Dorian's. The ceremony began, and the officiant spoke about commitment, trust, and the promise of a shared future. His words echoed softly through the church as the guests listened quietly. I remember looking at Dorian and feeling sure that I had made the right choice. Then the officiant reached the traditional part of the ceremony. His voice was calm as he said that if anyone present had a reason this marriage should not happen, they should speak now or remain silent forever. It was a sentence everyone had heard at weddings before, but no one ever expected someone to actually say anything. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then I heard a voice. "Wait. This wedding needs to stop." My heart dropped instantly. The voice belonged to Maribel. She stepped forward slowly, her expression serious in a way I had never seen before. The guests began whispering in confusion, and my parents looked at each other in shock. I felt frozen, unable to understand what was happening. In that moment, I believed my closest friend had just betrayed me in front of everyone I loved. After the ceremony stopped, and everyone was left confused, my mind kept going back to the beginning of my relationship with Dorian. Everything had seemed so perfect when we first met that I never imagined anything could go wrong. I met him about a year and a half before the wedding at a charity dinner organized by one of my coworkers. I almost didn't go that evening because I had a long day at work, but my colleague insisted that I should come for at least an hour. The event was held in a large hotel hall filled with soft lights, quiet music, and people dressed in elegant clothes. I was standing near the refreshment table when a man walked over and politely introduced himself. That was Dorian. He spoke calmly and confidently, but there was also a kindness in the way he talked. Instead of trying to impress people loudly like some of the others there, he listened carefully and asked thoughtful questions. We ended up talking for almost half an hour that night. He asked about my work, my family, and even small details about the books I liked to read. I remember feeling surprised that someone I had just met seemed genuinely interested in my life. Before the evening ended, he asked if we could meet again for coffee. His manner was respectful and not pushy, which made it easy for me to say yes. Our first coffee meeting turned into dinner a few days later, and soon we started seeing each other regularly. Over the next few weeks, Dorian continued to show the same thoughtful behavior. He remembered small things I mentioned in passing, like my favorite restaurant or the type of music I enjoyed during long drives. Sometimes he would bring me a book he thought I would like, or suggest quiet places where we could talk for hours without interruption. My friends and family met him not long after we started dating. Most of them liked him immediately. My parents said he seemed polite and mature. Some of my coworkers even joked that I had found someone too perfect to be real. But there was one person who didn't seem completely comfortable. Maribel Knox. She had known me since we were children, so she understood my personality better than almost anyone. At first she was friendly with Dorian, but I noticed that she watched him carefully during conversations. One evening after we all had dinner together, she pulled me aside and asked a simple question. "Are you sure you know everything about him?" I laughed when she asked that. To me, it sounded like she was just being protective. I told her that Dorian was kind, respectful, and everything I had hoped to find in a partner. I reminded her that sometimes people simply meet the right person at the right time. Maribel didn't argue, but I could see that she wasn't fully convinced. She said she hoped I was right and that she only wanted me to be happy. At the time, I thought she was worrying for no reason. As the months passed, my relationship with Dorian grew stronger. We spent more time together, and eventually he asked me to marry him. When I said yes, I believed my life was falling perfectly into place. Looking back now, I realized that while I was completely in love and excited about the future, Maribel was quietly paying attention to things I never noticed. As the months passed after our engagement, my life slowly began to revolve around Dorian. At the time, it felt natural. We were planning a wedding, talking about the future, and building what I believed would be a stable life together. I trusted him completely, and because of that trust, I didn't question many of the changes happening around me. Dorian always seemed eager to help with decisions. He offered advice about small things at first, like choosing a venue or deciding on guest lists. He spoke calmly and logically, and I appreciated how involved he was in the planning. Many of my friends even told me how lucky I was to have a fiancé who cared so much about the details. But over time, his involvement grew beyond wedding plans. He started asking about my finances in what seemed like a casual way. One evening while we were having dinner at home, he asked how I usually managed my savings and investments. At first, I thought it was a normal conversation for a couple planning a future together. He explained that he believed partners should be open about money and long-term goals. His reasoning sounded responsible, so I answered his questions honestly. Soon after that, he began suggesting small financial ideas. He mentioned better ways to organize my accounts and talked about planning for things like buying a house someday. He never pushed too hard, and his tone was always calm and patient, which made his suggestions seem reasonable. Around the same time, he also became more involved in other parts of my life. If I mentioned a work problem, he would offer advice. If I talked about family matters, he would suggest ways to handle them. At first, I felt supported, like I had someone dependable beside me. To everyone around us, Dorian appeared thoughtful and devoted. But Maribel started noticing something different. One evening, she came over to help me with wedding invitations. While we were sitting at the table, she asked how things were going between me and Dorian. I told her everything was wonderful and that he had been incredibly supportive. She nodded slowly, but didn't look convinced. Then she said something that stayed in my mind later. She told me that Dorian sometimes seemed to study people carefully before speaking, almost like he was measuring every word. She said it reminded her of someone trying to understand how to influence a situation before acting. I laughed at her comment and told her she was overthinking things. To me, Dorian was simply thoughtful and observant. I even teased her, saying maybe she had been watching too many crime shows. Maribel forced a small smile, but I could see she still felt uneasy. Despite her concerns, the wedding planning continued. We chose decorations, finalized the guest list, and prepared for the ceremony. Dorian remained calm and charming in every situation. Whenever someone complimented him, he responded politely and never seemed uncomfortable with attention. Looking back, everything appeared perfect on the surface. But while I was happily preparing for marriage, Maribel was quietly watching details that didn't sit right with her. Small things that I ignored began to build into a feeling she couldn't shake. And eventually, that feeling pushed her to do something she had never done before. About 2 months before the wedding, Maribel started paying closer attention to Dorian. At that time, I had no idea what she was doing. To me, she was simply helping with wedding plans and supporting me the way she always had. But inside, she was feeling more and more uneasy about the man I was about to marry. Maribel later told me that her concern didn't come from one big moment. It came from many small things that slowly built up. She noticed that whenever people asked Dorian about his past jobs, his answers were always brief and general. He would mention the names of companies but rarely talk about specific experiences or coworkers. At first she thought maybe he was just a private person. But one evening during dinner with several friends, someone asked him about a project he had supposedly worked on at a financial firm years earlier. Dorian gave a short explanation, but when the conversation continued and more details were mentioned, he quickly changed the subject. That moment stayed in Maribel's mind. Another thing she noticed was how carefully he controlled conversations. Whenever someone began asking deeper questions about his background, he smoothly redirected the discussion to something else. Most people didn't notice because he did it politely and naturally. But Maribel noticed. The more she thought about it, the more she felt something didn't add up. She tried to ignore the feeling because she knew how happy I was. The last thing she wanted was to cause problems between us. But the closer the wedding came, the stronger her doubts became. Finally, she decided to quietly check a few things. She started with simple online searches about some of the companies Dorian claimed to have worked for. She wasn't trying to prove anything wrong at first. She just wanted to reassure herself that everything was normal. But the more she searched, the more confused she became. In some places, the timelines of his career didn't make sense. Certain years seemed unclear, and the job positions he mentioned were difficult to verify. Maribel tried to find records of employees from those companies during the time he said he worked there, but she couldn't find his name. At first, she thought she might just be looking in the wrong places. Still, the feeling in her mind kept growing. She checked other details he had mentioned in conversations, cities he claimed to have lived in, organizations he said he had been part of. Some information seemed vague or incomplete. None of it was clear enough to prove anything was wrong, but it was enough to make her uncomfortable. Maribel struggled with what to do next. She knew that if she came to me with only suspicions, I might think she was trying to sabotage my relationship. Our friendship had lasted many years, and she didn't want to damage it by making accusations without proof. So instead of confronting me, she kept digging quietly. What began as simple curiosity slowly turned into a serious search for answers. She told herself that if everything about Dorian was real, then she would happily admit she had worried for no reason. But deep down, she had a feeling she was about to uncover something far more serious than she expected. Maribel continued searching because the questions in her mind refused to disappear. At first, she only checked basic information, but after seeing how many details about Dorian didn't match properly, she decided to look deeper. She began reviewing public records and older documents connected to the places he claimed to have lived. One evening, while going through several old records, she noticed something strange. A photo appeared in a document connected to an engagement announcement from another state. The man in the picture looked exactly like Dorian. At first, Maribel thought it must be someone who simply looked similar to him. But the more she looked at the image, the more certain she became that it was the same person. What confused her even more was the name written under the photo. It wasn't Dorian Kessler. It was a completely different name. Her heart started beating faster as she opened the full announcement. The document described a man who had been engaged to a woman named Corinne Daly. The engagement had taken place several years earlier, in a city far from where we lived. According to the announcement, the couple had been planning a wedding at the time. But when Maribel continued searching, she discovered something disturbing. The wedding had never happened. Instead, several months later, there were small reports connected to a financial complaint. The details were limited, but they suggested that the man involved had disappeared suddenly. The report mentioned that a large amount of money had also gone missing from the woman's personal savings. Maribel sat there staring at the screen, trying to understand what she had found. The photo looked like Dorian. The story sounded too similar to ignore. A man who had convinced a woman to marry him, gained access to her trust, and then disappeared before the wedding. The possibility terrified her. She checked the photo again and compared it with pictures of Dorian from social events and our engagement party. The resemblance wasn't small. It was the same face, the same eyes, the same calm smile. At that moment, Maribel realized she might not be dealing with a misunderstanding. She might have uncovered a pattern. But she still needed stronger proof. One photo and a few reports weren't enough to confront someone about something so serious. She knew that if she told me without clear evidence, I would likely defend Dorian and refuse to believe her. So she decided to take a step that made her extremely nervous. She searched for the woman from the old engagement announcement, Corinne Daly. After some time, she managed to find contact information connected to her name. Maribel hesitated before reaching out. She knew that contacting a stranger about something so personal could be painful or even unwelcome. But she also knew that if the story was true, someone had already been hurt before. Taking a deep breath, Maribel finally sent a message explaining who she was and why she was asking questions. She didn't know if Corinne would respond, but she hoped that the truth, whatever it was, would finally come out. A day passed after Maribel sent the message, and she heard nothing. She began to wonder if she had made a mistake contacting Corinne Daly. Maybe the woman had moved on and didn't want to revisit something painful from the past. Maribel even thought about deleting the message and pretending she had never sent it. Then, late the next evening, her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but she answered anyway. On the other end was a woman with a calm but cautious voice. She introduced herself as Corinne Daly. For a moment, Maribel didn't know what to say. The situation suddenly felt very real. She carefully explained why she had contacted her. She told Corinne that she believed the man in the old engagement announcement might now be using the name Dorian Kessler and was about to marry her best friend. There was a long silence on the phone. When Corinne finally spoke again, her voice had changed. It carried the quiet weight of someone remembering something painful. She asked Maribel one simple question. Does he have dark eyes and a calm voice that makes people trust him quickly? Maribel's stomach tightened. Yes, she replied. Corinne let out a slow breath, and then she confirmed what Maribel had been afraid to hear. The man Maribel was describing sounded exactly like the man who had once been engaged to her. But at that time, he had used a completely different name. Corinne began telling her story. She explained that she had met him several years earlier. Just like with me, he had appeared kind, attentive, and deeply interested in her life. Their relationship had moved quickly, and within months, he had proposed. She believed she had found someone who truly cared about her. During their engagement, he gradually became involved in her financial decisions. He offered advice about investments and savings, always presenting himself as someone who understood money well. Because she trusted him and believed they were building a future together, she allowed him access to some of her financial accounts. Then, only weeks before their planned wedding, he disappeared. At first, she thought something terrible had happened to him. She tried calling and messaging him, but he never responded. Soon after, she discovered that a large portion of her savings had been transferred out of her account. By the time she realized what had happened, he was gone. Corinne told Maribel that the situation had been investigated, but the man had vanished without leaving clear traces behind. She had spent years trying to recover emotionally and financially from the betrayal. As Maribel listened to the story, the fear in her chest grew stronger. The details were too similar to ignore. Before ending the call, Corinne said something that made Maribel even more certain she needed to act quickly. She said that if the man truly was the same person, then he would likely disappear again once he gained enough trust and access to resources. And with the wedding only days away, Maribel realized time was running out. After speaking with Corinne, Maribel couldn't sleep that night. The story she had heard was too serious to ignore. Every detail sounded dangerously similar to what was happening in my life. She kept thinking about the upcoming wedding and how close I was to legally tying my future to a man who might not even be using his real name. But even with Corinne's story, Maribel knew she needed something stronger before confronting Dorian. Accusing someone of being a con man without clear proof could destroy lives, including my friendship with her. She needed evidence that would be impossible for him to deny. The next few days became a race against time. Maribel started gathering everything she could. She saved copies of the engagement announcement she had found earlier. She printed the photo showing Dorian under a different name. She also wrote down the details Corinne had shared during their phone call. Corinne even agreed to confirm the story again, if necessary. Still, Maribel was nervous. She considered telling me everything immediately, but she hesitated. She knew how deeply I trusted Dorian and how excited I was about the wedding. If she approached me with this information and I refused to believe her, it might push me even closer to him instead. She kept imagining the worst possible outcome, me believing Dorian over her and cutting her out of my life completely. At the same time, doing nothing felt impossible. So she decided to try one small step first. A few days before the wedding, she invited me out for coffee. I remember that meeting clearly now. At the time, I thought she just wanted a break from wedding planning. We sat at a quiet table, talking about normal things at first. But then Maribel's expression became serious. She asked me again if I truly knew everything about Dorian's past. I laughed lightly and told her she was worrying too much. I reminded her that relationships require trust and that I believed in the man I was about to marry. Maribel looked like she wanted to say more, but she stopped herself. She realized that without showing all the evidence, her words would sound like nothing more than suspicion. And revealing everything right there in the cafe might give Dorian time to twist the story or disappear before the truth came out. That's when she made the hardest decision of her life. She decided that if I wouldn't listen before the wedding, she would reveal the truth during the ceremony itself. It sounded extreme, even to her. Stopping a wedding in front of friends and family would create shock, embarrassment, and chaos. But she believed it might be the only way to prevent something worse from happening. So she prepared carefully. She placed all the documents, printed photos, and notes into a folder. She kept it hidden and carried it with her as the wedding day approached. She also told Corinne to be ready in case someone needed confirmation. Maribel knew that once the ceremony began, she would have only one chance to stop it. And she was ready to take that chance if it meant protecting me. The wedding day finally arrived, and everything looked exactly the way I had imagined for months. The church was decorated with white flowers and soft lights. Guests filled the rows of seats, quietly talking while waiting for the ceremony to begin. Outside, the sky was clear, and everything felt calm and beautiful. No one could have guessed what was about to happen. When the music started, the doors opened, and I began walking down the aisle with my father. My heart was beating fast, but it was the kind of excitement people feel on an important day. At the end of the aisle stood Dorian, looking calm and confident in his dark suit. Next to him stood Maribel, holding her bouquet as my maid of honor. From where I stood, everything seemed normal. Her face looked serious, but I assumed she was simply emotional. Weddings often bring strong feelings, and I didn't think much about it. When I reached the front, my father gently placed my hand in Dorian's. The ceremony began, and the officiant started speaking about love, trust, and commitment. The guests listened quietly as his voice echoed through the church. For a few minutes, everything moved forward smoothly. Then the officiant reached the traditional part of the ceremony. He paused and looked around the room before speaking the familiar words. If anyone present knows a reason why this couple should not be joined in marriage, speak now or forever hold your peace. Normally, that moment passes in silence. But not this time. Before anyone could even breathe, Maribel stepped forward. "Wait," she said clearly. "This wedding needs to stop." The entire room went silent. At first I thought I had misunderstood what she said. But the shocked expressions on the faces around me made it clear that everyone had heard the same thing. My heart began pounding as confusion rushed through me. Guests started whispering, and my parents looked completely stunned. I turned toward Maribel, unable to understand why my closest friend would interrupt the most important moment of my life. Dorian's hand tightened slightly around mine, but when I looked at him, his face had lost some of its calm confidence. Maribel walked closer to us, holding a folder in her hands. Her expression was steady, even though the room around her was filled with murmurs and shocked voices. For a moment, I felt something break inside me. I thought she was ruining my wedding because of some suspicion or misunderstanding. I felt embarrassed, angry, and hurt all at once. In front of all our family and friends, it seemed like she had just betrayed me. Then she gently placed the folder into my hands. "Before you say your vows," she said quietly, "you need to see this." My hands trembled as I opened the folder. Inside were printed photos, documents, and papers I didn't recognize. As my eyes moved across the first page, confusion slowly turned into something much heavier. Because the man in one of the photos looked exactly like the man standing beside me. But the name written under that photo was not Dorian Kessler. For a moment, I couldn't understand what I was looking at. The photo in the folder showed a smiling couple standing close together, clearly taken during some kind of celebration. The man in the picture looked exactly like Dorian. The same face, the same calm expression, the same eyes I had trusted for more than a year. But the name printed under the photo was completely different. My hands began to shake as I turned the page. There were more documents inside the folder, printed records, dates, and short reports that didn't make sense to me at first. Around us, the church had grown louder with whispers, but I could barely hear anything over the sound of my own heartbeat. I slowly looked up at Dorian. For the first time since I had known him, he didn't look confident. The calm smile he usually carried was gone. His expression had become tense, like someone who had just been caught in something he didn't expect. Maribel stepped forward again and spoke so everyone in the room could hear. She explained that the man I was about to marry had once been engaged to another woman in another state. At that time, he had used a different name. She told everyone that the previous engagement had ended suddenly when he disappeared along with a large amount of the woman's money. Gasps spread through the church. Dorian quickly tried to interrupt her, saying that the documents were fake and that someone must be trying to frame him. His voice was louder now, and for a moment he sounded angry rather than calm. But Maribel didn't back down. She pointed to the photo again and calmly mentioned the name Corinne Daly. She explained that Corinne had personally confirmed the story and was ready to speak if necessary. When Dorian heard that name, something changed in his face. The confident control he usually showed disappeared completely. For a brief moment, he looked directly at Maribel, and the expression in his eyes was not one of surprise. It was recognition. That single moment told me everything I needed to know. The whispers in the church grew louder. Some guests were standing now, trying to understand what was happening. My parents looked shocked and confused, and several of Dorian's acquaintances were staring at him with disbelief. I felt like the ground beneath me had disappeared. All the memories of the past year rushed through my mind. The conversations, the promises, the plans for the future. Every moment I had trusted suddenly felt uncertain. I looked at Dorian again, hoping he would deny everything in a way that made sense. But he didn't. Instead, he slowly let go of my hand. Without saying another word, he turned away from the altar. The guests moved aside as he walked down the aisle toward the exit. No one tried to stop him. The entire church watched in stunned silence as the man I was supposed to marry simply walked out of the building. And in that moment, I realized the wedding had not been ruined. It had been stopped just in time. After Dorian walked out of the church, the room stayed silent for several seconds. It felt like everyone was waiting for someone to explain what had just happened. The music had stopped, the ceremony had ended, and the guests were left staring at each other in confusion. I stood there at the altar, holding the folder Maribel had given me. My hands were still shaking, and my mind was struggling to catch up with reality. Only a few minutes earlier, I had believed I was about to begin a happy marriage. Now the man I was supposed to marry had walked out without even trying to defend himself properly. That silence in the church felt heavier than anything I had ever experienced. Eventually, the whispers started again. Some guests looked shocked, others looked sympathetic. My parents quickly came toward me, their faces full of concern. They didn't know exactly what had happened, but they could see that something serious had just been revealed. I remember looking down at the documents in my hands again. Each page felt like another piece of a puzzle I had never known existed. The truth was painful, but at the same time it was becoming clearer with every second. The man I trusted had been hiding a life I never knew about. Slowly, I turned toward Maribel. Just minutes earlier, I had believed she had betrayed me in the worst possible way. I thought she had ruined my wedding out of suspicion or misunderstanding. But now I understood something completely different. She had saved me. If she had stayed silent, I might have married a man who was planning to deceive me the same way he had deceived someone else. I might have spent years discovering the truth too late. Tears filled my eyes as I realized how close I had come to making a terrible mistake. Maribel looked nervous, almost afraid of how I might react. She had taken a huge risk by stopping the wedding in front of everyone. For a moment, she probably thought I might hate her for it. Instead, I stepped forward and hugged her. The church remained quiet as that moment happened. My emotions were mixed: shock, sadness, relief. But above everything else, I felt gratitude. My best friend had been brave enough to stop everything before it was too late. Later that day, many guests slowly left the church, still talking about what they had witnessed. My parents stayed beside me, offering comfort and support while everything settled down. In the days that followed, I learned even more about the truth Maribel had uncovered. Authorities were already interested in the man who called himself Dorian Kessler because of similar situations in other places. It became clear that disappearing from weddings and relationships had been part of a pattern. Thinking about it now still sends a chill through me. But one thing is certain: the wedding that never happened was not the worst day of my life. It was the day my best friend protected my future, even if it meant standing in front of a room full of people and stopping everything. And because of that courage, I walked away from the altar without a husband, but with something far more valuable: a friendship strong enough to save me from the biggest mistake of my life.